Please welcome Nick. Thank you.
So hi, I'm Nick Hemley, CTO of Bristol Pound, and here today to talk about how to build a really good local currency. We've had a few years in terms of a run-up at this, and there are a few insights and things that we can share in terms of the Bristol Pound and exactly what we are. But before we get into the local currency, maybe we can take a step back and actually ask the question, what is money? And the textbook answer is there on the screen. It's a number of different things. It is a store of value, a unit of account, and an unit of exchange. But that's not the end of the story. I think actually that's the start of the story, because money is actually a relationship. And as we've heard before, it's a relationship of trust. And if you can imagine that trust is something that probably occurs in concentric circles, and as you go further out towards the edge of the onion, you have greater uncertainty in terms of the trust, and therefore you need a greater understanding of what the value and the persistence of the value. So, for example, cast your minds to way back to, for example, if there was a trader on the Silk Road, they would probably be bartering. They would want to exchange their goods for something that they knew would persist over time. And funny money from whatever country they were traveling through would not be good enough. They would want gold. They would want something that they could be sure that would persist over time in terms of the value. So fast forward a few hundred years, and focusing specifically on payments and ignoring the rest of the banking behemoth, we have a structure something like this, and I apologize for the poor UX. I'm not a UX designer, as you can see. I promise there will be a little bit of color in the slide later on. We have here actually two business models overlapping, and someone in the 1950s realized it was actually two business models. You have merchants and merchant banking, so the people who provide the banking for merchants, businesses, and you have cardholders, i.e. individuals, and card acquirers, so the people who offer the banking for the individuals. Now, interestingly, along came Visa and grew out into an association because they realized that you can't actually deliver a single card that would work across all these different banks, but you could trust a brand. So that's when the Visa brand was born, to become an association that would link these two business models. Great. Okay, so that's modern banking in a few seconds. So where does Bristol Pound fit into this? Well, we describe ourselves as a values-based FinTech. We're using financial technology, but for a different reason other than profit. Sure, we are a community interest company, so we are incorporated, but as a community interest company, we actually have purpose for our profit, and that purpose is in the constitution of the company. So we describe ourselves as values first. We think we're pretty unique, other than some of the other currencies that do exist in the UK. Recently, the Lakeland Pound have launched as well in Cumbria, but they are paper only. So we do paper, and for example, I've got a back pocket full of 20s. But we're also a digital channel as well. So we have text to pay via SMS. We also have an app, and people can make digital payments. Great. So that's where we came from. It was born out of a transition town movement to reclaim the 2% that we believe shouldn't necessarily be going to Visa, but could be going back into the community in a closed-loop system. And it's evolved from there. We're not just a currency anymore. We're actually moving more into financial services, and I'll touch on that in a bit. So the elements of a really good currency, unfortunately, this slide hasn't particularly worked. Again, hold my hands up to that. UX obviously is my forte. But there are a few bits and pieces that you need to get in place if you could be persuaded to start the York Pound, or more radically, the York Euro, perhaps. But let's not go there. Let's put that to one side. I should note at this point that the Bristol Pound is backed 1-to-1 by sterling. Every single Bristol Pound in circulation is held in a sterling trust account, backed 1-to-1. If there were to be a run on us, we could give the whole lot back, and that's just good financial controls. right? So one by one, we'll whip through these. So you need a ledger. So anyone who's running a currency would need a ledger. Actually, you need two ledgers, because one ledger is actually the fiat currency. So this is where you have sterling coming in and out of the system. That is actually reconciled to our virtual currency. And here we have, obviously, hints of cryptocurrency-ness about it, but I can explicitly say we're not a cryptocurrency, but we are a closed system, just the same as a cryptocurrency would be. So we have our Bristol Pound, which, for all intents and purposes, is a virtual currency. It only exists in a ledger. So you need a ledger to run this. It's good financial sense. You also need to be a regulated entity. So we bootstrap this via the Bristol Credit Union. So they're our partner, they're our regulated entity. They're actually regulated as a credit union. But you don't necessarily need to be regulated as a credit union. You could also be an e-money institute. You do need to be regulated. The FCA need to have sight of what you're doing. They're actually fairly lenient in terms of what they would expect for reporting. But having said that, to be an e-money institute, it seems like quite a huge regulatory burden, but it's not. To be a SEMI, which is a small e-money institute, you fill in the forms, you can outsource the compliance, and it's actually not too onerous in terms of starting up a currency. So these two concepts are your physics. This is the physics, the laws of this system. So liquidity. Liquidity is the total amount of money held in the system. You need to have money entering the system, and initially, this was done through consumer spending. So people actually buy into it. They give us sterling, we hold that sterling, and we give them Bristol pounds, and then they spend those Bristol pounds. So that's half the story. You also need velocity. And velocity, as the name would suggest, is the total movement of the money that's in the system around the system. It's no good the money just sitting in accounts and not being spent. We want that money to be constantly circulating and being redistributed amongst the members. So we enable velocity through brokering. So what we're trying to do is get the money moving. For example, there might be a consumer business who are taking income in Bristol pounds. We then work with them, with other suppliers, so they can spend that back into the system. So one of our North Star metrics is the total amount of money that's actually moving on a monthly and a yearly basis. So what makes all this a reality is a community on both sides. There has to be a community of merchants, typically they're independent businesses, and a community of like-minded individuals who actually get what a local currency is about. And effectively, we're matching these two up. These consumers are VIPs from the point of view of independent businesses. They're going out of their way not to spend in sterling, but to spend in this funny currency. And independent businesses realize this and want to empower them because they realize that these people are an important group to them, and we can enable the marketing to this group. And that is part of our function. The other thing is obviously a local currency doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a context. The context for us obviously is Bristol. And we've been building over time this coalition of the willing. So basically this is the key stakeholders that we see as vitally important to engage with. And it moves us from a hipster currency in which you can spend in the local coffee shop through to a systematic economic intervention in the locality, which is where we want to be. We want to be at that end. And to get to that end, it means that we need to engage with these people. So, for example, you can pay your council tax in Bristol pounds. Great. I mean, that's super. But that's not the end of the story. What then happens within the council? Well, they then procure that money back into the system. All of the architects that Bristol Council employ are paid in Bristol pounds. So then it starts coming back around again and circulates. There's not just having a sink, and by sink I mean something where money ends up not being used, because that's not great for the distribution within the system. And we're also engaging with the university, the airport, and also local energy companies. So both Bristol Energy and Good Energy will take their energy payments in Bristol Pound. And then obviously we're then working with them to then pay their income back into the system. And latterly also, we've been engaging with the university and the airport. We would like every single student in Bristol to have a Bristol Pound account. Similarly, we would like every single tourist who comes into the city to be greeted with Bristol Pound, and both in notes or in the digital app. And if you can imagine, every single Bristol Pound paper that ends up down the back of the sofa or on the wall or eaten by the dog is a pound actually in Bristol Pound's pocket, because we have backed that in the trust fund. So every 3 years, when these things expire, we get a bit of a windfall because of all the money that's left. But that's not our purpose. It's slightly antithetical to what we do. But we realize that the paper pounds is good marketing, but actually where the real action is in the digital channel. So our organization has been through quite a lot of turbulence. It started as quite a radical idea born out of the transition town movement. And it's moved, I think, now slightly away from the green agenda, which would be lowering supply chains, using more local suppliers, to more of a social agenda, which I'll touch on in a minute. So we like to think like a startup. We have an explore phase where we're trying out new ideas. We have the expand phase where we're actually building out the systems that are actually going to scale, and then some kind of optimization phase where we're able to optimize and then at that point measure the key metrics. In doing so, we've built a pretty good governance board of critical friends. We've built an advisory board of people who can advise us on the regulatory side and on the technical side. And obviously, we have our ops team, which is the day-to-day. We also have pretty decent financial controls, as you would expect for a local currency. We have the trust fund is actually held at Triodos Bank. And as you can imagine, having a paper currency as well as the digital, there's an awful lot of reconciliation of cash points going on. The Lakeland Pound have come up with a really hit on a really decent idea, which is used post offices. So they have cash points at every single post office in Cumbria, in the Lake District, and tourists know that that's where they go to get the money. We haven't done that. We've used independent businesses. It wasn't necessarily a great idea because they're more focused on their business and not necessarily reconciling our cash. So we're moving more towards the Lakeland model. So any social impact organization needs a theory of change. And here's the color that I promised. This is basically our theory of change, which we've been kind of building and maturing over time. So key enablers moving through all the activities and outcomes to our ultimate goals. And the ultimate goals for a local currency is a more equitable, more inclusive, resilient economy. And I think that this was born out of the 2008 downturn, age of austerity, and we are very interested to see how Bristol Pound does in the next financial crash. We are pegged to pound. I'm arguing that we shouldn't be. We should probably be pegged to something else in March 2019. But anyway, that's my personal bugbear. Great. So just last couple of slides. Obviously, we need a value proposition. Bristol Pound has had a bit of identity crisis in terms of its purpose. Now we're moving towards more of a B2B focus. We're starting to do business loans. Not just business loans, they're going to be interest-free loans to locally social businesses that have some kind of social impact. Not only we can do that, we do that with the money on deposit, and we do it interest-free. And it's kind of, this isn't a loan as you would think of a loan, it's a loan Bristol style, okay? So if I have 12,000 Bristol pounds, I lend it to a business, and when they then spend it with a third party, we then get the 5%. It's called a first supplier levy. It hasn't really been tried anywhere, not that I know of. Do tell me if you've come across it before. But effectively, what that means is that your spending finances your loan because we're able to recoup our costs through the first supplier levy. Anyway, if you want to have any more detail, I'd be happy to bore your senses with it. That was the Bristol Pound. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick, for a very well-pitched introduction to what on the surface sounds like it should be a really straightforward concept, but as soon as you get just below the surface, it's insanely complicated. Right, first of all, a point of clarity for me. You're creating an artificial currency that is only relevant or is only targeted on one particular community. In the long term, is the idea that the value to that community is that you're making sure that particular part of the currency recirculates only within that area? Or is it that you're increasing the buying power of that currency relative to other currencies?
Okay, well, we definitely see ourselves as a payment choice provider. So we want to give people a choice in terms, so they can actually choose whether they want to use sterling, and that's fine. I think it's an interesting thing to have sterling as your main competitor, but then arguably, actually, it's not sterling, it's Visa and MasterCard and the frictionless payments. So I think that the ultimate vision is actually probably to step back from the consumer side of things and really focus on the business side of things. And historically, that hasn't been true, but the new focus, I think, is naturally on the business side of things, and we are then seen as the champion for independent business in Bristol. And the interesting thing is that when you move to doing business loans, then you're able to then do targeted loans. You could be targeting entrepreneurs in Knoll West, and we do the last mile lending to make sure that we are engaging with those people. And so it can be very, very geographically targeted. So yes, we are the Bristol Pound, but we can then align with some of the council objectives in terms of wards of multiple deprivation, in terms of bringing capital to those areas and making sure we're focused and aligned with that political agenda, although obviously the Bristol Pound is an apolitical organisation, but obviously we suddenly do find ourselves talking the same language with certain political parties. Okay, thank you. So if we were in crypto world, which I know we're not, it would be about the appreciation of that token and its value locally having more spending power than but it's not about that, it's about keeping it local. I think there's an element where, if you're talking about wealth distribution versus wealth creation, I think we want to be talking about both. And I think at some point you have to take a view on those two competing concerns. Certainly with the circulation, we're talking about the redistribution of that wealth through a value-based system that I think people have to self-identify with to actually want to be involved in the first place. So it's almost that value system is something that we have to be very careful to construct and then present so that people can resonate with that and say, well, actually, I think that's a really good thing to be involved in. So the liquidity that we've historically had from consumers can now come from other places, i.e. the business loans. Yep. So standing outside of that community for a second, and maybe to put a macroeconomic perspective onto the microeconomics of the Bristol Pound, how is this not hyper-local protectionism? Well, I would argue that protectionism on a macroeconomic scale is a completely different concept. So what we're trying to do is keep something in rather than keep something externally coming in, which is the whole point of a barrier or a trade tariff, is trying to prevent something happening, whereas we're trying to enable something within a closed system. So I see them as very different, and I don't quite. I can see the challenge in terms of applying something that's at the macroeconomic to the micro. But I don't think they're the same concept. Okay, good. I'm not an economist, so I wouldn't know. But thank you. This idea of a York pound is tantalising. If the York pound came to be, how would it interact with the Bristol pound? Would it? How does this spread? Yes, that's a good question. Currently, none of the actual currencies do interoperate. I think that's fair to say. Perhaps in the future, given the right technical platform, they could potentially interoperate. And I think there certainly is a vision on some level to have a network of local currencies that do. Otherwise, yes, if you go to a different city, you're having to open up a new account and use a different currency. Yeah. But maybe that's the same problem that they saw in the 1950s in terms of how the Visa Association came about. That was an individual bank that realized that if you're at a different bank, you're going to have to open a different card. But no, we have an overriding association of people who join the association and you're able to spend it. The same thing could be true on national scale. So although it's not necessarily on our roadmap, we're very much focused on the Bristol Pound. But I think that in future, if there were to have other technologically superior and enable systems that were able to interoperate, then that would be a great development, I think, and quite an interesting one.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about digital wallets very, very briefly as a way maybe to bring some of the other panelists in. But in crypto world, the idea is that a lot of the tokens that might be specific to one utility or one kind of security kind of blend into the background. And at the end, the digital wallet takes care of all of that interaction between currencies, and the user just has whatever is in their reserve to pay for whatever they want. I guess that could be a gateway into local communities interacting, local community currencies interacting in the same way. Looking at the panel, plans afoot for digital wallets, maybe at Atom. Is this something that crypto can step in and help with, or are we barking up the wrong tree? Is it all about the folding stuff, really?
So from our perspective, we're not heading into that territory. I think when you look at some of the regulation that's coming down the line there with open banking in particular, it's interesting how different societies will behave with this, or demographics, if you like. So open banking should, in theory, be connecting everybody's financial landscape into one place, whether I've got a First Direct mortgage and I want to put it in next to my Aviva pension, for example, and see it all in one place. I think there's a huge hurdle to overcome back to trust again. So will people actually trust those banks to behave properly once all the data starts to connect? You look at what's happened with Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah. So that's interesting, because the community currencies surely have trust in spades, but only locally. So how does that translate outside of that locality?
I've got a question, if it's okay. I'm just fascinated that there's the anti-establishment Bristol mindset, I think. So from just in terms of the types of groups and cultures that are there, is that one of the reasons why you started in Bristol, or?
It's a good question. I think that it's fair to say that Bristol is quite a unique place in the sense that it's got quite a liberal ethic. It's definitely a yellow city. So politically, I think it's well aligned to exploring what the alternatives could be. The flip side of that is that I think that quite a lot of radicals can be a bit disorganized, and it's more about the idea than the implementation. And to my mind, as a delivery head, the delivery is everything, the implementation is everything, and therefore, to actually do justice to the idea, you have to deliver well. It's not just about having the highfalutin idea. Yeah. So Bristol's good for the ideas, it's less good for the delivery, and I'm hoping that actually it can improve on the latter.
Right, so the locality has to have a fit with the sense of it, which is
why
I kind of like the York allegory as well.
And just to pick up on the point about the digital wallet question and whether banks are going down that route. So my understanding is that due to anti-money laundering directives, banks will not touch crypto. And with good reason, because there's a lot of illicit funds and there's a lot of opaqueness. People can't really understand where the funds came from, and that's not good enough from a regulatory perspective. The regulator will dish out fines if they're not happy, and the fines can be quite substantial. I mean, there was a recent case with Danske Bank and Russian money being laundered through Danske, and that ended up in a huge fine and potentially criminal proceedings. So I think banks are keeping crypto pretty much at a barge pole's length. But that's not to say that will change in the future as the regulation changes.
And that, I think, is probably a perfect link into what Doug's about to talk about. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, ask us to park it there. But thank you very much, Nick. Fascinating stuff. A round of applause for Nick.
Thank you.